In opening government, IT Bandung A. Opening opposition, Rosario B. Closing government, Keio A. And in closing opposition, the team from BINUS. Teams have done preferred pronouns in the background, and I suspect the chair will refer to them by their speaking positions. We're having us, oh, fantastic, they managed to put it up there. Okay, so this year's grand final motion is, this House believes that it is unjustified for collaborators to assist evil regimes in systematically persecuting members of their identity group in order to mitigate and moderate the regime's abuses. And we list 2 examples. Good luck to all teams.
If there are no questions about the standing orders, I'd now like to invite the Prime Minister to speak for the motion which will bear their name. Here, here.
Am I audible? In World War II, France collaborated with the Nazi regime so that part of the Nazi dominion is controlled by them. These are the type of behaviors that we are against in opening government. Because in opening government, we believe that when there are oppression, your duty as an identity group is not to be a collaborator, betraying your own group and betraying your own people that will be abused day to day, but to stand in opposition to the atrocities of the regime. We say that we must revolt, we must fight back, and we think that this is what is moral to do. We're going to prove what should be the moral standard in fighting oppression, and I'm going to talk about 3 things. Number 1, I'm going to begin by talking about who's the beneficiary of the collaboration. Number 2, I'm going to explain what's the comparative if we choose not to collaborate at all. And number 3, lastly, why the comparative, the trade-off at the end of the day is something that's worth it. Let's begin with who is the beneficiary of the collaboration. I'm going to begin by dispelling the myth that being a collaborator will make your identity group better off, because we say that that's a lie. You are not going to be better off as an identity group. Why is this the case? How do evil regimes work? How do evil regimes oppress people, ladies and gentlemen? You need to understand that as an evil regime, your end goal is to seek for profit. You plunder resources, and this is something inherent, that at the end of the day, all evil regimes will always put fear on this identity group by continuously killing them so that they are afraid of revolting and taking back power to the hands of the people. That evil regime will always force many of the oppressed group to be a forced labor, working for free, guaranteeing that their oppression machine can continue. So the question is, who benefit? Because we will concede that there might be a moderation of the oppression, but the question is, who will be the beneficiary of that moderation? We say that the beneficiary will be exclusive to the well-connected, the leaders of the minority group, those that are rich, those that are privileged, those that held the seats of power, like the nobles, for example. We say that these are people who are privileged enough, and we say that it is unlikely that the moderation of oppression will any be different, right? Why is this something inherent? Obviously, because if you as a leader, even if you choose to be a collaborator, even if you choose to push less and less discrimination and less abuse, we say that it is impossible that the regime will ever follow you and to choose to extend the moderation to other people who are not part of the privilege. Why? Number 1, because at that point, the regime are unable to benefit fully from the oppression, right? Because when they choose to oppress your people, when they choose to acquire all those free labor, if they choose to no longer do it, then they take away the biggest source of their profit. But secondly, note that in the event that they choose to comply with you, that they have less and less oppression coming to your people, then they will feel that their authority is threatened, right? It is beginning to be taken away by you at the end of the day. That's why they are unlikely to be able and to want to comply and reduce the German oppression. What is the meaning of all this? The meaning is that it is something inherent within every collaboration that the most vulnerable will keep on getting oppressed. And I think that there are lots of study cases for this, right? When Indonesian nobles made deals with Japan, the oppression happens at the end of the day. The abuse continues to happen to the poor on the nations, and it is only the nobles that are free. We think that at that point, the beneficiary is extremely, extremely limited and exclusive to a certain set of people. Before I move on, yes?
I think it's highly uncomparative because I believe in their side of the house, there will be more fear, more oppression, and they'll be highly more likely to be violent to them. I prefer my side of the house. Be comparative, please.
Yeah, what's the comparative, right? Let's move to my second argument. The comparative is taking the fight to them. Be a freedom fighter. And the first thing that I would like to talk about is why it can work. Because we're not going to say that it's going to be an easy fight and you're going to win in matter of days. We can see it. It's not going to be an easy fight and there will be lots of blood involved. But the comparative in this debate is on the probability of success, ladies and gentlemen. Because what you need to understand is that the probability of success if you do this is significantly much higher, right? Why? Number one, because you can seek for alliances. Because now there's a message of you fighting oppression together with other groups that are oppressed as well. You are not seen as a group that choose to betray the other oppressed group to the oppressor, but you are seen as a group that are saying no to the moral deprivation of the oppressor. It means that you say no to the regime as a whole. And we think that when you bond together with many other oppressed groups, there are many strategies that you can have, right? Despite the asymmetry of the power between you and the oppressor, we think that the strategies are always there. Guerrilla warfare, for example, hiding in plain sight. We think that the Vietnam is a good example of success of such type of warfare. We don't see why it cannot be done again. But the second thing that is the most important is that you don't actively empower the regime, ladies and gentlemen. What you need to understand is that when you choose to become a collaborator, the probability of success of ending oppression is significantly less because you are going to continuously empower the regime at the end of the day. And this is a trade-off that opposition bench must accept, right? Because when you choose to collaborate, you need to give something to the regime so that your own ass is safe. And it means that you are going to be giving things that are making the regime stronger. How do you generally collaborate? You give your resources, ladies and gentlemen. You give more and more people to their labor camp. You give capital that increases their strength at the end of the day. In World War II, for example, oppressor from Japan got stronger because of the provision of oil and police force in the Romusha, for example, making defeating them significantly harder at the end of the day. And that's the trade-off, ladies and gentlemen, that they have. A regime that's continuously oppressing and is significantly much stronger at the end of the day. And this leads me to my final point as to why the trade-off is worth it. Because we agree that in the short run, there will be more people that are killed because the regime sees us as a threat. The regime will attempt to eliminate us at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, we say that it's worth it. Why? Because in all the success, we have a higher likelihood. And we think that this is worth it because in the long term, if the regime is stronger, if they are more entrenched, they can A, survive more longer, continuing the oppression of our people more longer and ending up with more bodies anyway because they survive so much longer. And B, you never have the guarantee that they will not cross you back, right? Because at one point, you might get out of resources. You might no longer have any resources at the end of the day. You might no longer have any oil to give to the regime. And at that point, the regime might see you as having no value whatsoever. And that is the time in which the regime will be willing to end those ties. And they have already been much stronger than they were before, making defeating them so much harder, risking your position so much more, and causing more deaths at the end of the day. But secondly, is on the moral victory. Because we'll accept that in the very worst case scenario, even if it ends in failure, at the very least, there's a dignity in the fight, right? Because rather than our people dying as slaves, our people dying in oppression, we would rather be dead when we choose to take up arms and fight the evil that is our oppressor. We say that we will end things in dignity, and that is a much better moral high ground. Under all those reasons, we proudly propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for those remarks. I now invite the Leader of the Opposition to address the House.
Three things from OO. Firstly, why we think this is better than any other alternative in reality. Secondly, why we think this is the most effective way of preserving the minority, which is the main goal that any collaborator or any part of this identity group should have in this kind of oppressive governments. And thirdly, why personally it's completely justified that anyone that is part of this minority group should look for some kind of survival and for some kind of hope, and I think it's worth it for us to do it. But first, rebuttals. So firstly, they tell me that beneficiaries are only going to be the best connected part of this identity group. Firstly, we think that this doesn't always happen. We have trickle-down effects. In reality, what happened in Nazi Germany was that even the high part of the community and the highly connected part of the community was the one that was highly beneficiated by these collaborators. Also, the lowest part was being beneficiated because basically we had a trickle-down effect in which if we mitigated the violations and the oppressions made by the German government, that also had effects on the lower part of the community. But even if it didn't trickle down into the low part of the community, we think that it's better for well-connected, for example, in this case, Jews in reality to survive and to have better conditions than their side of the house, in which Jews are being killed, in which Jews are being taken to concentration camps. We think in that comparative, it's better if we preserve the Jews that have highly well connections than a world in which no one has a chance of survival, no one has a chance of escaping this oppression. Second, they tell me that they prefer to fight for the people and fight for freedom in these oppressive regimes. We think that if what they want is probability of success, we have to think how these oppressive regimes really work and work in reality. Because these oppressive regimes are highly violent, and most of these identity groups are minorities that are not only minorities in terms of numbers, but in terms of education, in terms of money, in terms of means of fighting against these kind of communities. So basically what we have here is an identity group that is likely to lose. And they tell me that it's morally acceptable if they lose. We think that in reality, in oppressive regimes and oppressive regimes that are trying to extinguish identity groups, they should not look for what is morally acceptable or what they should morally do, but for survival. Why? Because what matters the most to an identity group is that their identity is preserved, that they can strive in the future, that they can be and survive the regime. Basically, what this means is that the principles in this debate are not as important as what reality can get you and the results that collaboration can get to you in reality. Thirdly, they tell me that we're going to empower the regime. We think that not necessarily we're empowering the regime, but even if we're empowering the regime, if this means survival, if this means less violence to our population, to our minority group, it's way better. But first, I take opening.
If your regime is empowered that much, how do you guarantee that they will always prioritize your survival at the end of the day?
That will be my constructive. So firstly, why we think that it's better than other alternatives. As I was telling you, we are in a situation in which this identity group is structurally defeated, which means that in the Nazi camps situation, the Jews, the people from Poland were structurally defeated. They had no way of fighting against the regime in a way that they could win. So firstly, why we think that not doing anything is not an alternative that we would buy as the OO in this debate. Firstly, because there is no then guarantee of mercy from the oppressor, which means that this oppressor that is doing this debate, that is doing all these strategies in order to inflict fear and inflict violence into the population is more likely to engage in more violent and oppressive matters, because this is what is giving them the power in reality. So that's why we think that not doing anything is not going to be helpful for any part of the identity group. But secondly, and engaging with OG, why we think that fighting against directly with this oppressing group is not going to be effective in reality is because of the asymmetry. And they tell me that the asymmetry is not as bad as it seems, but let's think what happens in oppressive regimes. right now and what happened in the past. These oppressive regimes had the idea that they would strive and they will preserve themselves in the future and in time if they inflicted fear and if they inflicted violence in reality. So basically, every sort of contradiction to the government, it's a threat for their stability in the future. So basically what we're doing when we fight against them is giving them another reason to attack us way more, to be way more oppressive, and to destroy the whole identity group that we have in reality. So why is mitigation and moderation so important in these identity groups? Because in most identity groups, what is more important in the reality, or what is highly important, is the way they die, because the way they die signifies the dignity they had in life. When you remember someone that was slaughtered, or someone that was cut into pieces, or that died in a concentration camp, you think that that person didn't die as a person, but that person died as an animal, or died as a thing. Basically, what you're doing is you're taking out their dignity by the way this oppressive regime is acting towards them. We think in the comparative is way better for these collaborators to fight for mitigation and moderation. Why? Because maybe this will dignify a lot more the people who are going to die in either side of the house in these debates and in the oppressive regimes. Why? Because maybe moderation and mitigation will let them speak to their families. Maybe moderation and mitigation will let them die in a less violent way and in a more dignified way. We think that this enhances the possibility of these people not being stripped from their, depicted from their dignity in reality. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition. I invite the Deputy Prime Minister to have the floor. Here.
Check. Am I audible? My rebuttals is going to be based on the two main contention. One, I'm going to contextualize how does the abuse moderation manifest and why does it not as utopic as opening opposition wants to portray to you. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the comparative on why fighting is much more feasible and beneficial under our side. And lastly, if I have time, I'm going to talk about the eventual allegiances of this collaborator, why in most cases they go to the bad guys and why that's harmful. So first contention, let's talk about how does the abuse moderation manifest. So first of all, let's resolve who will be the beneficiaries of this abuse moderation. Because opening opposition claims that eventually the beneficiaries are going to be the majority because of this quote-unquote trickle-down effect. But note, panels, that this trickle-down effect concept has never been explained under their side. On the comparative, we are going to contextualize to you who are the collaborators specifically. What we say to collaborators of these rival regimes will not be everyone, ladies and gentlemen. The collaborators will not be your average peasants, will not be your average citizens, but most likely, the collaborators are more powerful people in these areas, such as, for example, the politicians, the generals, the technocrats, and so on and so forth. Why is this phenomenon inherent? Two reasons. One, my partner has told you the incentive structure of these evil regimes. That is to say that they will never take much benefit if they don't do things such as forcible land takeover or forced labor. Because the thing that we must recognize is that oppressing regimes comes with a cost. That is to say your troops died, your money spent on tanks and bombs, and thus you must make your investment worth it. Secondly, I'm going to extend this point, is by saying the perception of the superiority coming from the evil regimes themselves. We must talk about people like Nazis that think that the Aryan race is inherently strong race ever. We are talking about the past European colonizers that also think that this is the best, that their race is also the best as well. And we must understand the specific nuances here. These specific actors perceive the others as subhumans, ladies and gentlemen, and they will never consider these other races as more than pawns at the end of the day. The strategic conclusion of this point is that under both sides, the majority of people will be oppressed, but the question is, in which side is the likelihood of us fighting these evil regimes higher, and that is the thing that will explain explained later. But let's move next to who are specifically the collaborators. What we say is that these politicians, generals, are the higher privileged people in comparison to the general population in these areas. We are talking about generals and technocrats, and that supposedly are able to utilize their power to fight this regime at the end of the day. A good case study will be the majority of the Polish people, by the time they are occupied by Nazi Germany, escaped to United Kingdom and set up a provincial government there, right? What I'm trying to say here is that they do have the option to fight back, but the reason that's why they collaborated is not necessarily because purely they have pure intention to help the majority of the people, but it is merely because of their selfish intention. So this is my first contention. Second contention is about the comparative, right? On why do we think fighting is much better under our side of the house. So let's contextualize. How does these freedom fighters operate? We are talking about some Jews in Poland during World War II. We are also talking about some Indonesian guerrillas that destabilizes the Chinese rule also during World War II as well. Why is this likelihood to be successful? Why do we think that these people have a likelihood to be successful? In general, because of two reasons. One is because we must recognize that in general, the context of the warfare we are talking about is an attrition warfare, ladies and gentlemen. That is to say that the losing side are eventually going to lose because they run out of resources first. This is the case with Nazis in World War II, right? In which they lose because they run out of oil, because they run out of metals to build tanks, bombs, and so on and so forth. We argue that the demolition of resource center is easy, ladies and gentlemen, because what you need to do is you just need to secretly explode train networks, for instance. You need to burn farm and refinery centers. We can see that asymmetry exists, but it only exists insofar as we face them head-on in a conventional warfare. This does not happen at all in a guerrilla warfare, in which these evil regimes are not even able to locate. Who are these people, and where are these people located to begin with, ladies and gentlemen? So we think that this is much beneficial under our side. Before I move on to my second point, do I have an POI? Yeah.
If the characterization of individual are as selfish as yours, then in your side of the house, these individuals won't help by opposing because they're selfish.
Okay, here's the thing. What we need to recognize is that selfishness exists on a spectrum, right? Most likely, the incentive of these collaborators are not necessarily to only help their asses only. They do help some of the oppressed people, but they do not have the majority. Of these oppressed people. So that is our case. You should engage to that. Second point is my Prime Minister's point that has never been engaged under opening opposition. Because notice that the amount of help that we are going to do to empower these regimes is massive, ladies and gentlemen. You are talking about literally providing troops to fight in some areas of this war. You are talking about providing resources that are able to sustain their war efforts at the end of the day. We think that in the instances in which we reduce their ability to get resources, that is time in which we do have high likelihood to fight all of these people at the end of the day. So in conclusion, the fight happens much better under our side. So those are the rebuttals. So let's move on to my extension next, about the eventual allegiances of the collaborator, why in most cases they go to the bad guys. So let's recognize that in all cases of history that we know, eventually all evil regimes are defeated by the good guys. We are talking about Nazi-controlled Vichy France that are eventually defeated after D-Day. We are talking about the Japanese Empire that are also defeated in World War II as well. But oftentimes, at the point in which this time comes, the collaborators have cooperated with these evil regimes for a very long time, ladies and gentlemen. And eventually they experience shifting allegiances because they don't interact with the good guys, because they provide resources exactly to these bad guys, sometimes to the extent of these collaborators even rewarded if they do good things that are significantly beneficial to these evil regimes at the end of the day. What is the implication of this? The implication of this are twofold. One is a change of identity, ladies and gentlemen. That is in which these collaborators eventually empathize less to the good guys and starts identifying with the bad guys eventually. This is one of the reasons as to why the majority of Nazi collaborators after World War II has ended escapes to countries like Latin America and Spain after World War II has over, even if they might not necessarily come from Germany at the very start of the war. But second implication is the anger from the oppressed is also something that is big, ladies and gentlemen, in which, like for example, many Vichy France collaborators are eventually imprisoned for life. But what is the importance of all these two arguments? Two things. One is that all of these collaborators, after conflict resolution has been done, are not able to contribute to the country development post-conflict resolution, ladies and gentlemen. And since I have characterized to you before that oftentimes these collaborators are exactly the people who have the potential to use their power and their knowledge to build the country as much as possible, we say that this is a harm that is significant. But second and most importantly is that by principle this is just bad, right? Because you are turning the good guys into the bad guys and you have full agency to choose otherwise, but you don't choose to do so. We say that by principle this is also something that we should should regret. So in conclusion, we say that under both sides of the house, people will be eventually oppressed anyway. But the question in this debate is, who provides the higher likelihood for us to fight these bad people? We say that that exclusive comes under opening opposition, under opening government. We close the case of opening government.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. I now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to address the House. Here.
In the first place, I will deal with the material brought by the opening government, and then I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on what Juanita already gave you, and then gave a point of extension on how personally this is justified for anyone to actually take this course of action. So first of all, the moral duty, or the moral principle of the debate. So the first thing they said is that the beneficiary of collaboration will always be the privileged class in the oppressed minority or in the oppressed group. A few things to say here. First of all, they didn't, for example, rebut in a good way the trickle-down effect that Juanita already described to you. Because if he characterizes the oppressor as someone who sees a whole bunch of humans as subhumans or animals, that is to say that, for example, for a German, a rich Jew or a poor Jew are just Jews, and that they are mainly animals to him, he won't, for example, be given privileges to rich Jews and being more hard or harder or more violent on poor Jews. So we think that from the side of view of the oppressor, they are all the same, and therefore, for example, the collaboration will not only benefit the privileged class, but actually everyone. Second, we think that in the example, even if, for example, the privileged class was to be the one that is actually benefited from the collaboration, we think that in the comparative, it is way easier and it is better to have someone who is actually from your group treating you instead of, for example, a foreigner invader or something like that. Second, we aren't, I don't know, as uncomfortable as of having, for example, these privileged minorities actually being benefited, because if we actually characterize who actually leads the resistance movements, who actually leads the liberation movements, there are not, for example, impoverished individuals of the minority, but actually people with political and cultural and economic capital who can actually organize this minority in the future. So we are not as comfortable of having the privileged minority being privileged, because this minority, this privileged minority inside the oppressed group is actually the one who's going to lead the rest of the minority into resistance. This was the case, for example, in liberation movements here in Africa, where you have, for example, that the people who led the liberation movements in Rwanda and in Central Africa weren't, for example, the most poor people in society, but actually the people who had education and something to give. And for example, the case, the French case, where, for example, the movement of resistance in France was actually led by Michel Manoukian, who wasn't a poor individual who knew actually nothing, but rather a professor or someone privileged in society. We would be happy to actually have these people privileged, but before I continue, I get closing.
Tell me the incentive of this oppressive regime to just simply listen to this oppressed minority if they have still ability to kill them.
Okay, what I'm saying is that when you have someone from the minority collaborating with yourself, you start seeing them as something not as, for example, threatening, or something not as dangerous as you will be in the first place. Because when these people arrive to a country and they're going to, for example, slaughter everyone in there, they're thinking that, for example, all of them are a threat to their existence, or, for example, that all of them are dangerous. We think that when someone starts collaborating with you, you stop treating them, or you stop at least seeing them in the comparative as dangerous as you saw him in the first place. Because why? Because he's collaborating with you. He's actually not resisting you. We think that what Juanita brought to you in her speech was actually a backlash argument in which, for example, when you start resisting at the first moment when the invader arrives and you do not collaborate, if he already sees you as a menace or as someone dangerous, he will see you even more dangerous, and therefore he will have incentives to actually inflict even more violence into your people, because he thinks that you are a threat, because he thinks you are a threat, or he thinks that you are extremely dangerous. Second, they say that, for example, this actually cuts the ground for resistance movements to actually appear in this context. The first thing they say is that, for example, you get more alliances in their side of the house, because people from the outside don't see you as someone who is okay with oppression and else. We think that alliance will also be obtained in our side of the house, mainly because alliance comes from actually the opposition of the values that are defended by the oppressor state. We think that even though the French people actually collaborated a lot with the Germans, the Americans kept fighting for the French and actually liberated them, although France wasn't known by having a lot of resistance, but actually by having a lot of collaboration. We think that alliances are possible in our side of the house too. Second, we think that, for example, moderation, that is to say, for example, giving people a better treatment, or at least less violations of their rights, actually strengthens resistance, because these oppressors are actually always focusing themselves on breaking the spirit of the minority itself. They are treating them as animals, because they think that, for example, when you treat someone like an animal, he starts thinking he is an animal, and for example, he is less likely to actually think he has to free himself, or to actually, for example, lead liberation movements. We think that moderating abuses actually gives you more resistance and stronger resistance, because people won't have the full effect of abusing in themselves. So passing on to what we have on opening opposition. First of all, I'd like to know that the whole argumentation and our whole case on how moderation is specifically valuable to these minorities when death is actually near is extremely important. Juanita tells you that it is way more likely to have, for example, even if it's someone privileged, a member of your identity group actually respecting the ways you have to actually die. For example, what she said basically was that if you have someone of your identity group actually inflicting the violence in our side of the house, this violence will be moderated in such a way that it isn't as harmful as the artist would be in, for example, the government's case. This is to say that, for example, if your group has some identity that spins around the fact that you have to say something just before you die, or that, for example, you don't have to die a certain way in order to don't lose your dignity, we think this could be achieved way more easily on our side of the house, because this is the moderation we're talking about. This is the moderation we're talking about because this specific knowledge of how your culture sees death is only achieved in our side of the house, because it's someone from the identity group who is actually collaborating with these oppressors. We think that, for example, oppressors won't care that much on how, for example, these people are treated, because they won't see this as a threat, because they will only see this as, for example, you killing the person you needed to be killed with in the first place. So what Juanita also said was that this, for example, is an effective way of preserving the minority. If you're, for example, a group, a cultural group, or a cultural minority that is being threatened by an oppressor with complete destruction, we think it is justified to say that even if you're a privileged member of the society, the fact that they are not killing you means they're not killing all of the group itself, and therefore, objectively speaking, the group is preserving itself, even if it is a privileged part of the minority, which we are okay with, and even though that, for example, this privileged minority is more likely to lead posterior resistance movements, and that's it. Second, you also explained to you how the other alternatives aren't much likely to say. For example, they say that in principle everyone should fight. They, for example, don't acknowledge that in order to fight you have to have certain specific knowledge. First of all, certain specific knowledge about how to fight. And for example, it's also an exclusive narrative in which you say that, for example, people who don't have enough courage to actually engage in physical violence or engage in physical combat with the oppressors aren't deemed to be worthy and shouldn't be helping at all. We think that even if the only way you can actually help is not engaging in violent conflict, but instead collaborating in order to moderate your abuses that a perpetrator inflicts on your people, it is completely justified. Thank you very much.
Thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. To begin the second half of the debate, I invite the Member of the Government to take the floor. Go ahead.
we think about the character of these oppressive regimes, what is the incentive for them to cooperate with these people from oppressed minority? When we see that this the oppressed minority, opening government correctly characterized that these are the ones who have an economic capital, but also a spiritual support by the people from this oppressive group. This is the precise incentive of this oppressed regime to cooperate with this individual. One of the most effective way in tackling or murdering or bullying a vulnerable individual or vulnerable group is to destroy their spiritual backbone, but to also to gain massive amount of information. When we look at this characterization of this person who are about to cooperate with this oppressive regime, they have massive amount of information. But on the other hand, if we look at what these oppressive regimes look like, they have ability to kill this individual, ability to torture this individual, and extract many information as possible. It is not enough for the opposition bench to just say they are a potential scenario in which that this way will be effective in protecting minorities. They need to prove us why this will be the most effective one. What we're going to be proving from closing government is precisely this. We're going to be telling you why this attempt in itself is very, very likely to be counterproductive for the protection of this minority, to the extent that we can call this attempt in and of itself is unjust. That is the extension from closing government. So firstly, I'll talk about number one, who are these characters, and two, I'll talk about what is the impact for these people suddenly betraying their own group and go to this oppressive regime. And thirdly, I'll talk about the counterfactual and why continuing the status quo will be better on comparative to their side. Finally, if I have time, I'll talk about why self-defense is still unjustifiable, considering that these people are basically the leaders. Before that, several clarifications to opening opposition. So if we look at the mechanisms in which opening opposition tried to say that this will be effective tool, is by saying, analyzing the problem under their side. They firstly say the reason why they are oppressed is because they are regarded as subhuman or regarded as something dangerous, something as different culture. If the reason is just that there are different culture or regarded as dangerous, I think this is not really an oppressive regime if they are to stop this oppression when they realize that you can cooperate. They're talking about example like France, but I don't think France is an oppressive regime that we're talking about right now. We think the oppressive regimes that we're talking right now is the regime like, for example, Nazi, that you obviously know that these people are going to put your people in your gas chambers, for example, right? We think these are the main character that we need to deal with. But more importantly, when you are regarded as subhuman, what kind of conversation that that they're expecting on the opening opposition? I think that these people will be just used as the tool and not any of these empathy or not any of these conversation. You will be put into the jail and just be tortured, and I don't think this will be effective at all. That is why when opening opposition just lazily analyze the problem, that saying that they're regarded as subhuman, I think that this policy will not be effective effective under their side of the house. Now, let's move on to the first point. So, who are these people? As opening government correctly characterized, these are the leaders of this these groups, because otherwise this oppressive regime will just shoot you and kill you, right? Like an ordinary Nazi individual, ordinary Jewish individual was just shot by this Nazi in that area. That is why That's why, ladies and gentlemen, we think oftentimes the people that we are talking about are the one leaders. Why is this problematic? Firstly, this group will lose the mental support. Why is this true? When your leader suddenly, it looks like your leader have suddenly betrayed your own group and went to your oppressive regime in order to protect yourself, because otherwise, if they are firstly, it's impossible for this individual leader to just tell it to every single member within your own community. Will just do it by your own, right? Therefore, it looks like you have betrayed your own group. We think this is bad because when you know that your leader have went somewhere else and you have no other alternative leader, it means that the special support for these people will disappear. What does it mean by losing hope? What does it mean by losing strong leaders? It means you're gonna lose your hope, right? Because nobody is leading you, nobody is telling you where to go and what strategy to take. What is the consequence of that? When people lose hope and think alternative is that you will be shot down by the Nazi elsewhere, we think that these people, for example, choose to commit suicide or choose to do something else, choose not to to continue to fight against, because you think that it's possibly impossible to fight against. You think that it's much more harder to fight against these groups. That is why losing mental support in and of itself is a problem. It's harder for this next leader to pop up. But secondly, more importantly, it gives more justification for people in your group to betray and have more, leak more information. Why is this true? When the leaders suddenly betray your group and go for self-defense, it looks like for the member of the community that this leader have betrayed and just ran away. What does it mean? This means the member of this community will do the same thing, will try to do the same thing, and say, I have massive information that where, for example, like Jewish individual are hiding right now, and try to seek for asylum or try to seek for protection. We think this is bad, but on our side of the house, if the leaders continue to send a strong message that you should never cooperate with the suppressive regime, we think the possibility that these people betraying your own group will drastically decrease on our side of the house. Losing information means that it's impossible for the group, for the minority individual to continue to live in a safer space or continue to self-defend himself. That's why it's going to be massively harmful. But finally, we think it's going to be losing valuable information, and we think this in and of itself is harmful. What kind of valuable information? Where people hide, for example, what kind of strategy that they have. All of these kind of things is really important. Before moving on this, yes, closing.
How can, in your side of the house, this individual share information when in your side, the most likely scenario is this Jews locked up in a small room? Then why opposing can help?
Sorry, again?
There's no probability in your side of the house that these individuals can get information when these Jews are locked up in a small room anyway in your side.
Look, you can torture this people who betrayed it, and if you can't get this information where people are hiding, it is obviously easier for this Nazi individual to go get and arrest many of these people. So why do we think this is very likely? But more importantly, we need to question the efficacy of being betraying or being cooperation. So we say that this oppressive regime can kill you and can torture you. Given this moment, what kind of conversation is likely to happen on the opposition paradigm? I seriously don't get why is it likely. But more importantly, this leader will think that if I die, it's going to be harmful for our community. That is why this leader is very likely to be selfish and very likely to prioritize the protection of yourself. That is why it's more likely that these people will betray and more likely to harm your own community. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, what is the counterfactual? We think continuing the status quo is at least good, because if we look at the history, most of the oppressive and terrible regime have been cracked down by the international body. International body. But more importantly, when you continue to fight back against this group and tell your subordinates that you should never cooperate with this oppressive regime, it means that the possibility of your information leaking or possibility of your place that you're hiding will decrease. This means you can protect the most vulnerable at the end of the day. For all that reason, because this choice in itself has really, really low effectiveness, we think this is unjust to begin with. For all that reason, I'm very proud to propose this motion.
I thank the member of government. I invite the member of the opposition to take the floor.
Opening opposition shows us why collaboration would mean less oppression from this kind of evil regime like Nazi, right? But we think that this is a justification motion that CEO will show you why it is morally abhorrent for you as a leader to not choose to submit and not choose to sacrifice your own people for the sake of your own ideal that you want to fight, for example, for the sake of this kind of French people. We think that it is exactly that in your side of the house, these leaders are selfish, that they only want their own ideals to be fulfilled, right? We think that we will also show you that collaborative regime, for example, like Fiji, France, that submit to Germany can help the resistance better exactly because they have the power. That they have been given exactly the power by by Nazi, for example, that they have their own autonomy. We think that this means that they will be able to help the fight with the allies, for example, better, right? So let's kick CG out of the debate first, right? Because we don't see why CG's extension is important. The people will lose hope and they will betray their own people. For one, we think that exactly that what leaders should do is not just blindly giving you hope and tell you that you should fight whatever happens, for example. When that exactly, as the leader, as an individual that have more information, that knows the situation better, that you are more educated, for example, that you know everything that is happening in the war, it is your responsibility as a leader to make the best decision for your people. That regardless of your own idea, regardless of your own, that you want to win the war, for example, it is your responsibility to protect your own people. We think that this exactly that the principle of leader that you should do this. But two, we don't think that it is exactly betraying your own people, like giving information, etc. Right? That you can only submit. That we are talking about civilians, for example. That civilians that don't know anything, that they only want to survive, that they submit to this oppressive regime. We think that it is only self-defense when you choose to survive, when you cannot do anything else, where you don't have any other choice. We think that this is not exactly betraying your own people. But going to first issue then, why by principle it is morally abhorrent for you to not make the decision to save your own people? Because firstly, let's characterize the situation where this kind of thing happens. Like it is like World War II, where France and the entire mainland Europe is under the German occupation. The British and US troops is far from ready. They don't have the power. That Germany also has a strong navy, for example. That Japan rules in Asia, that no other power can
On that
rival
point.
them. That, for example, the Tibetan government under the Chinese Communist Party, for example, that there is no hope for these Tibetan people to be free, exactly because there is nothing they can do, right? And that this means the calculus for the leader is exactly right. That the situation is hopeless, seemingly hopeless, even if the opening government wants to try to say you that in theory that you can win, that there is, for example, 0.5% of possibility of you can win, that the calculus and the decision that this leader makes is exactly right, because they prioritize the betterment that is not the probability of you to win, that is very low, right? But secondly, we think that these collaborators' biggest responsibility is to their own citizens. So even if this empowers the evil regime so much, we think that it doesn't matter. Because, for example, that the leader in France that make Vichy France, that their main responsibility is to protect the people of France, that they owe, for example, for the French people too, that they need to do anything to protect their children, right? That Wang Jingwei want to protect Chinese people, for example. That this means that in extreme cases of survivability, we consider this as a self-defense. That they need to protect and they need to prioritize the interests of the people that they are responsible to begin with. That it is okay even if you sacrifice other people, right? But thirdly, that you are not the only one that is being hurt when you fight, because they bring the idea that you should you should fight guerrilla war, for example. That you should attack their bases, for example. That this will also hurt other citizens. This will also hurt the innocent citizens. That when, for example, Indonesian revolutionaries fight the Dutch colonizers, that they attack their bases, for example, that the citizens, that the children and the mother, for example, and the woman is also being attacked and being more oppressed by the Dutch people. That after Tibetan riot, the Chinese government also curbing their right even more and more, right? But that you are not only talking about your own interests here, but you are also talking about the hopeless people, the most marginalized people that doesn't have any kind of power, that you are exactly making your selfish decision because it is okay for me to die, but there are people that don't want to die. There are people that exactly want to live longer, right? We think that you should also consider that these people interest, because every decision that you make will also influence their livelihood, right? Yeah.
Don't you think this cooperation in itself have an inherent risk for you to be tortured and leaking information, but also strike your coordinate to betray the group?
Well, if we cooperate, we don't think that we will be tortured because we will give the information, for example, voluntarily. But in your side of the house, that you will exactly be tortured, but the information will leak anyway, that people will die exactly because of that information. We think that in our side of the house, comparative is better. But second issue then, why the fight against this kind of oppressive regime will be better exactly when there are collaboration, right? Because firstly, they say that this will empower the regime because they might get the resources easier, they might get the information easier. But firstly, we don't think that this will empower the regime. Because if their problem is resources and information, we think that this kind of thing can be obtained forcefully, that you can torture the people, the prisoner, for example, that you can exactly enslave the population and take it by force, you can take the mind by force, for example. We don't think that this kind of thing is something that will empower, right? But secondly, we need exactly the characteristics of of collaborating is compromised. That you can negotiate, for example, as the government of Vichy France to the Nazi Germany, right? You can negotiate. That you can manage the resources, but you still have to pay the tribute, like 20% of all the resources to Nazi, for example. That is exactly minimize the kind of resources that you have to give and the kind of atrocities that this kind of oppressive regime can do. Because exactly that in their side of the house, Nazi will be in direct control of France, that Nazi can kill all of the Jewish people in France, but in our side of the house, at least the Vichy French government can only send like to less amount of Jewish people to Germany, for example. When you have this kind of thing, means that there will be less atrocities and there will be less power in our side of the house, that because we can compromise and we can do negotiation. But thirdly, with that exactly by cooperating, you can fight better. Because why? Because you still have power, that you still have your army, that you still have all of the information, for example. That this Nazi Germany shares their information to the government of Vichy France because exactly they think that we are an ally, right? That we can leak the information towards the allies, for example. We can leak the information of Germany troops station towards the United Kingdom so that they will be able to use it against the Germany. Right? We think this kind of cooperation is exactly better because we have power that in their side of the house, the kind of fight that will happen will only bombing several buildings. We don't think that this will change the course of the world. We don't think that this will mean empowerment. That even that you are only a guerrilla separatist movement that cannot change anything. We think that the power to change world is better in our side of the house. We propose.
I thank the member of the opposition. To close the case for the government, I invite the whip to take the floor. To close the debate, I invite the opposition whip to address the House.
Judges, all proposition benches are taking the cooperation thing for granted because they never tell you what kind of cooperation. We tell you that the kind of cooperation is probably sharing information. That's why you have a cooperation. That's why probably friends have cooperation with Nazi. It's like selling the arms deals or selling the oil and so on and so forth, right? It means there's a common trait in which you probably can get certain kind of information through this kind of cooperation, right? But okay, let's deal with the worst case scenario coming from all government benches. Number one, what if these evils can be defeated? But second of all, what if we sacrifice certain part of minorities? Because closing government seems want to argue that you will perpetuate this kind of people to kill other minorities because that is the only way for you to prove that you are part of part of the cooperation. We say in the most ideal world, all minorities group will cooperate with one another, right? To cooperate with the big regime. What does it mean? In the best ideal world, you don't need to sacrifice anyone, right? But we prove to you why it's okay at the end to sacrifice. But let's kick the OG extension because you will forget identity and so on and so forth because it's long time for you to cooperate. We say you remember every kind of history because that history has a violation towards your identity, towards your group. That's why even if in the future you cooperate, you does not erase the history. That is the reason why probably Nazis still remember, like Germany still remember by its Nazi, Indonesia still remember the colonization and so on and so forth. Two things in my speech. First of all, why the help of these minorities better happen in our side of the house. Closing government want to argue about information because they want to tell you that, look, if these minorities see that you are cooperating with the leaders of this kind of people who oppress you, these minorities will not share any information, right? Number one, I question in their side of the house how you will get information because the comparative in their side of the house, these minorities like Jews will also lock with Nazi soldiers. Japanese will also be locked by these Chinese individuals, right? It means in their side, there's also no way in which you can get information. Moreover, this is used as a tool. What it means? It means the likelihood in which these minorities will be locked up in the far away place in which probably your soldiers do not know where they're located means that you also cannot share any message or any information otherwise in the side of the house, right? But second, my question if this Jews is locked, how can they get another information of where the camp of other Jews is located? This is not like in status quo where you have social media and so on and so forth. These Jews do not know where is the camp of location of other Jews, right? Because they are not living in those kind of area. What is the conclusion? There is no better comparative in their side of the house. Second, let's deal with opening government best case scenario. They want to argue if Nazis are defeated eventually, then we rather oppose them, right? First, that is not a good study case. The reason is simple, because in status quo in their world, when Nazis are defeated, all Jews are already dead with a terrible dead ways, right? This is terrible death like hung, genocide, killing by locking them in 50 times 50 centimeter room to death, right? That is the comparative that you have in the side of the house. But second of all, the defeat of Nazis is not something that mutually exclusive. No, thank you.
Fine.
Why is that the case? Because even in our side of the house, you have a British and US and other people who probably do not cooperate with Nazi, but like friends, but they still oppose Nazis. It means not mutually exclusive. What is the question then? If they're going to be defeated in both sides of the house, then which have the better probability to help these oppressed people, like, right? In their side of the house, what you're going to have is Germany going to probably be attacked in their base camps by France and so on and so forth, right? Because they want to directly be oppositional. Then what's going to happen? Number one, you also probably bomb the Jews prisoners. I mean, you don't help the individuals on the ground anyway. But second of all, it's very likely that German soldiers in your side of the house will destroy their base camp, and because they know they're also being killed, and that's how you're indirectly killing all the Jews that you want to serve. What is the conclusion? It's rather unclear what is the benefit of government benches. Then what is the comparison in our side of the house? We say information and help is going to be better. Number one, you negotiate probably where you want to place the soldiers, because right now they're seen as someone who is in line with you. That means probably you have a cooperation in which you want to have an oil cooperation, right? Or selling armies and so on and so forth. That means you can probably displace that, place that kind of soldiers in the place that probably Jews also located. Why is this important? Because that is the moment that you have a direct check and balance on how you're treating the people on the ground, on how these other individuals is being oppressed and so on, right? It means the benefit is rather clear in our side of the house. But probably you also cooperate in higher military system. That is why you have a shared information, because the trade is not just like what they say. We give you money and you give us people. That is not the case, right? Why is that beneficial? Because right now you probably have a better detail on where this individual is located, where is the place of them being tortured, how to open the lock and so on and so forth. The higher probability in which this individual is better in our side of the house. Why is this exclusive? Because you need to understand all the context brought by upper government side of the house. The context is in the World War II. It means intelligence is very little. There's slow mobilization. You don't have a high quality technology in which you can locate people and so on, right? The only way you can actually know where is the precise location of the individuals that is getting oppressed is exactly in our side of the house when you have a cooperation with this kind of individuals. We do understand that comparative is you make them stronger, but the probability in which we can help these people is better, right? You have a good probability of escaping your minority member, prevent direct abuse. Even more important, information to defeat all your opponent. It is a better way in helping these minorities. But this is the case of asymmetric power. Then let's deal with the case in asymmetric power, right? Why is justified to help your identity? Closing.
If your alternative way of cooperation is providing oil or military resources, tell me how is it likely when you say that the character is oppressed minority? Isn't selling information or signaling to a member that you're surrendering is more likely?
Number one, I think you need to also realize that it's unfair burden if you say that cooperation won't happen. It means in some way or another, you need to explain what kind of cooperation that is going to happen, right? We say the cooperation is going to happen is very possible, in which you probably tell how you locate the soldiers, how you locate all the oil and people displacement and so on and so forth. I think the better probability happen in our side of the house better. Second issue, why is justified to help your identity? I think this is my member argument, never been rebutted by closing government, right? Because there is a condition in which there is an asymmetrical condition. In case of government, in case of the government don't have much resources like France or like Germany, right? This is case like Indonesia and Japan, right? Why you then have the ability to help this individual, or you have a justification? Because this is a self-defense mechanism in hopeless situation. It means the means justify all the state, right? Why is that the case? Because even in the losing position, the calculus of you is also to help the individuals on the ground. You feel hurted because your fellow Indonesian is being killed. The comparative in this side of the house, you also hurt the individuals who also genuinely want to help part of their members, right? This is seeing fellow Indonesian death. Sukarno seeing people of Nusantara being tortured and so on and so forth. The same feeling of people born in the same soil, but right now you cannot do anything. That is how you make individuals become less hopeless, even more in their side of the house. The comparative is you torture both the helpers and also those who want to be helped. We oppose. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for that debate. Please cross the floor and shake hands.